We're continuing a sermon series titled Epic Friendship. And this series, we're looking at some friendship that is written in Scripture and learning the good and the bad from those friendships, because in a Christian walk, friends play a vital role and it's worth exploring. By studying the people involved in the friendship and looking at their friendship itself, I believe that there are valuable lessons that we're to pull out from and apply in our lives. Today, we're going to be looking at another friendship on a story that we're somewhat familiar with. And I'm sure that you've heard the story of Job. And if you haven't, let me just give you a short synopsis of what's going on. Job is a person that is introduced as a blameless and upright. And he has kids, a wife, many land, and a great amount of wealth that is accounted by sheep or animals. And really, it doesn't get much better than that. And up in the heavens, God is bragging to the divine assembly about Job, about how great he is. And then Satan comes out and challenges God on Job's goodness. Satan essentially tells God that sure, Job loves God now, but take away his earthly possession and his children, and he will dump God just like that. God, in his infinite knowledge, agrees to the challenge, and Satan unleashes a force that kills all of Job's family except his wife, kills his servants, and reduces his home to dust. But guess what? Job remains loyal. He refuses to denounce God. Then Satan complains that Job stays faithful only because nothing was done to him specifically. So God, again, in his infinite knowledge, allows Satan to give Job a nasty rash and boils and blister all over his body. And these boils are so bad. There's a scene in Job where Job is taking a broken pottery and scraping it off his body, and it is just a disgusting picture in the mind. Now Job becomes a much less happy camper. After all, he was loyal to God, and look what happened. He doesn't denounce God, but he does insist that he deserves some kind of explanation. And that's when his friend Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar shows up. And this is starting at Job 2:11 to 13. Job 2:11 to 13. And this is what it says. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and the Zophar the Naamathite, heard about all the trouble that has come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him at a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. After you read this and stop here, you would think that Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar must be great friends. I mean, think about it. Job is going through a lot. They show up to comfort him and sympathize with him. They sat with for 7 days and nights and allowed Job to grieve. What a great friends, right? Just a great bunch of guys. Well, this isn't the end of things, but the beginning. Because throughout the rest of the book of Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar blames Job right away for all these bad things that are happening to him. All three of them go straight blaming Job for all the tragedy that he's going through. And it's not that they thought of this out of the blue. There was a reason for that. And the reasoning is called syllogism. Syllogism is this idea that God sends calamity upon wicked people only. So you suffer a tragedy, therefore you must be wicked or have done something wrong. Now, Job himself knows he hasn't done anything wrong, per se. So Job avoided this false syllogism, but his friends couldn't see beyond that. And it's very commonly accepted by Christians nowadays too, actually. But we have a fancier name now. It's called the theology of divine retribution. Sounds pretty cool, right? And this idea, this theology, it assumes that God blesses those who are faithful to him and punish those who sin. Now, this isn't entirely without biblical support. I mean, there are many cases in which God sends calamity as a punishment. For example, he did it at Sodom. Often our experiences and reality does bear out this theological position. In most situations, things turn out better when we follow God's way than when we forsake him. However, the issue is that God does not always work that way. But when we tend to believe that to be true, Jesus himself pointed out that disaster is not necessarily a sign of God's judgment in different places in Scripture. In Job's situation, we know that this isn't the case either, because in the beginning of Job, God commends Job for who he is. If you look at Job 1:8 and Job 2:3. But back to the story of what's going on. And honestly, for the three friends, for Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, anyone who has spent time with suffering friends know how hard it is to remain present without trying to give answers. Our instinct is to investigate what went wrong and identify a solution. Then we imagine we can help our friends eliminate the cause and get back to normal as soon as possible. We would rather give a reason for the suffering, and being right or wrong isn't the point anymore, than to accept the mystery at the heart of suffering. Job's friends falls into this misleading idea. And it would honestly be foolish to imagine that we would never do the same. How much harm have well-intentioned Christians caused by giving godly-sounding answers to suffering, even though we have no idea what we're talking about? How many times have you heard things like, it's all for the best? It's part of God's plan. God never sends people more adversity than they can handle. When God closes one door, he will open another. I mean, I've said these things plenty of times myself, but I want you to think about this with me, okay? And I want you to hear it with a grain of salt and really just open your mind and think about this. How arrogant is it to think that we know God's plan? How foolish of us to think that we know the reason and the explanation for anyone else's suffering when we don't even know the reasons for our own suffering. We try to fill the gap and essentially play God instead of allowing ourselves to be co-sharer of the tragedy and be a friend. Sometimes I think it would be more truthful and far more helpful to admit, I don't know why this happened to you. No one should go through this. I think if we can do this and then remain present in their lives, we may become an agent of God's compassion and a true friend. Something that it reminds me of, this idea reminds me of, is the movie Inside Out, where there's a scene where there's an imaginary friend named Bing Bong that sees the like a skateboard rocket thing falls into over the cliff, and he is just devastated and struck. And there is just two beings. One is joy and one is sadness. And Joy tries everything to cheer up, to give reasons to move on, and just being who she is. But Bing Bong is still devastated. And it isn't until Sadness sits next to Bing Bong and says, I'm sorry. You must be really sad. And that's when Bing Bong gets over it. And I kind of think about that in that way. But to give a closure on the story, God actually comes to vindicate Job from his friend who has the wrong idea, but also to teach Job and us a lesson that God does not have to answer to anyone for what he does or does not do. And you know why? Because he is God. That's it. He's God. And Job's experience teaches us that we may never know the specific reasons for suffering, but we must trust in our sovereign, holy, and righteous God. Our responsibility isn't to ask questions to discover an answer or tell an answer, but it's to obey him, to trust him, and to submit to his will, whether we understand it or not. Because when we do, I believe that's when we will find God in the midst of our trials, possibly even because of our trials. But in terms of friendship, I want you to reflect and think about if you are at times being Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, or maybe you have those kind of friendship in your life that can be destructive to you. Whichever side of the fence you're on, I truly believe that as a follower of Christ, we need to carefully and prayerfully evaluate these cases. If you're the one that is always trying to be righteous and giving out explanation when tragedy happens to your friend, perhaps you should really consider just being there for your friends and grieve together and learn to accept and trust God's will instead of trying to make things better in your own terms. And if you have friends who are constantly Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar in your life, maybe it's a friendship you should really evaluate. Because you can have any type of friendship, but not all friendships are beneficial.